Hello, listeners. This is the Wavecast Radio. This transmission is live. I need to say that first, because nothing about today feels stable anymore, and recorded statements already feel dishonest the moment they're played back. What's happening in Houston didn't begin with a warning or countdown. It began quietly, with confusion, with people calling emergency numbers and struggling to explain what they were seeing in front of them. The first reports weren't dramatic or organized. They were fragmented, panicked, unfinished. Someone just attacked a stranger for no reason. My neighbor is acting wrong. I think he's sick. There's a man biting people outside a grocery store. Dispatchers assumed narcotics, then psychiatric emergencies, then coordinated unrest. Each explanation collapsed faster than the last as the calls kept coming. Police body cameras show the shift in disturbing clarity. Individuals turning without warning. No shouting. No argument. Conversation stopping mid-sentence. Posture changing. One moment passive, the next violent. Officers keep saying the same thing in their statements. The eyes change first. Focus sharpens. Expression empties. And movement locks onto the nearest person. Hospitals broke almost immediately under the pressure. Patients arrived restrained, bleeding, screaming until their voices failed, thrashing against gurneys with strength that didn't match their bodies. Sedatives had no effect. Pain response didn't register. Nurses tried to speak calmly out of habit. Doctors tried protocols that have always worked. Nothing reached them. There's footage from inside one emergency room that hasn't been released publicly. People who've seen it describe a man with 2 gunshot wounds collapsing, then standing back up moments later. He walked toward the nearest nurse without a word, without hesitation. He didn't stop until his legs folded beneath him, and even then, his hands kept moving. Ambulance. Crews were pulled back within hours, not because they abandoned their posts, but because they couldn't function. Crews were attacked inside their vehicles, doors forced open at intersections, radios cut off mid-sentence. Some of the last transmissions are just breathing, shouting, then nothing at all. Outside, the city began to unravel in layers. Traffic lights became collision points. Cars were left running in the middle of streets. Fires spread where no one could reach them. Sirens overlapped until they became a constant, shapeless noise. And then that noise thinned as response vehicles stopped moving. What terrified responders most wasn't the violence itself. It was the absence of anything behind it. These weren't angry people. They weren't afraid. They didn't threaten, didn't retreat, didn't protect themselves. They moved forward until injured, and then kept moving until their bodies failed completely. Officials tried to calm the public with familiar language. Words like isolated, contained, and under investigation were repeated across briefings. But entire neighborhoods had already gone quiet. Not calm, quiet. Cameras still worked in some places. Streets were empty except for movement that didn't stop when shouted at. By nightfall, hospitals were sealed, police lines pulled back, and whole sections of Houston were effectively abandoned. Power flickered as crews stopped servicing failures. Cell networks overloaded, then thinned. Messages stopped delivering. People stopped answering. This is where it begins. Not with an explosion, not with an announcement, but with people suddenly turning on the ones closest to them, and no one understanding why. By the time the first medical teams began comparing notes, the scale of the problem was already far beyond anything they had trained for. Emergency rooms weren't just overwhelmed. They were collapsing under the sheer unpredictability of what they were seeing. Patients weren't behaving like victims of drugs, trauma, or mental illness. They weren't cycling through anger, fear, or confusion. Once the change came, it stayed, unyielding, unrelenting. The doctors watching felt like witnesses to a neurological execution. A human brain overridden from the inside, stripped of reason, empathy, and restraint. Neurologists scrambled to make sense of the early imaging. Across multiple cases, across multiple facilities, the scans told the same story. Overstimulation of the limbic system, total shutdown of the frontal cortex, regions responsible for decision-making, impulse control, and moral judgment rendered effectively inert. One physician described it as the brain being held hostage by its own survival circuits, caught in a perpetual threat loop, unable to reset or recover. There was no pattern, no selective vulnerability. Anyone could become a target or an aggressor at a moment's notice, regardless of age, health, or social conditioning. In internal memos, circulated under strict classification, doctors had to give this thing a name. Acute Aggressive Encephalopathy Syndrome. AES. Not a cause, not an explanation. Just a label for the devastation it created. That single memo marked a shift from disbelief to grim determination. It was no longer about treatment. It was about endurance, containment, and understanding what survival even looked like in a hospital where patients were weaponized against the staff. Sedatives failed universally. Antipsychotics had no measurable effect. Full anesthesia sometimes delayed symptoms for minutes, rarely hours, but the person inevitably woke, awake, aggressive, unstoppable. Pain, restraints, exhaustion, none of it mattered. Staff tried everything, from physical intervention to behavioral de-escalation techniques that had worked for decades. Nothing slowed the infected. Nothing paused the neurological breakdown. Witnesses describe it as a terrifying kind of inevitability. The human form intact. The humanity gone. Hospitals quickly became amplifiers rather than sanctuaries. Waiting rooms too dense, hallways too narrow, and staff too exposed. Every bite, every scratch, every drop of blood could trigger a chain reaction. Even brief exposure meant minutes, sometimes seconds, before the next person flipped. Floors were barricaded, supply closets locked from the inside, entire wings of hospitals abandoned to the infected. It wasn't cowardice, it was survival, cold and necessary, as those trapped became both victims and threats in the same space. Ambulance crews were the first to face impossible choices. In some areas, they refused calls not because of policy, but because they physically could not function. Vehicles became hunting grounds for the infected. Doors ripped open, while crews tried to help the wounded. Radio transmissions cut off mid-sentence. Some of the last messages were just heavy breathing, screams, and a snap to silence. Every attempt to respond became an exposure, risk. Emergency medical services collapsed faster than anyone predicted. Medical ethics broke down under the weight of the outbreak. Questions that once seemed abstract were suddenly urgent. Who do we save? Who can be helped? Who is already lost? Hospital administrators were forced to categorize patients not by prognosis, but by threat level. Once aggression manifested, a person was no longer a patient in the eyes of staff. The word non-viable appeared again and again in internal communications. Families heard it whispered, then printed in directives. Humanity had been replaced by triage, and the infected were considered beyond rescue. Families began to isolate the moment symptoms appeared. Sometimes they listened to warnings, sometimes they didn't. Chaos in households mirrored chaos in hospitals. Parents struggled with children who suddenly attacked siblings or themselves. Spouses were bitten while trying to intervene. Friends were forced to lock away the people they loved. In a matter of hours, homes that were once sanctuaries became active danger zones. Surveillance videos that would later surface showed doors slammed, barricades built from furniture, and terrified faces peering from windows at loved ones who were no longer recognizable. As hospitals failed, so did public trust. People stopped calling for help, stopped attempting treatment, stopped reporting emergencies. Heart attacks, strokes, childbirth complications. All went unaddressed. Mortality from indirect causes began stacking quietly, uncounted, while attention remained fixed on the immediate threat, the people transformed by AES. The secondary casualties were invisible in the early hours, but by the end of the day, the weight of systemic failure was already apparent. Researchers tried to find a window for treatment, a weak point in the disease, any potential pause. There was none. The incubation period was measured not in hours or even minutes, but in seconds for some. Anymore, contact with infected blood, saliva, or bodily fluids could trigger near-instant collapse. Isolation, barriers, avoidance, these became the only reliable strategies, not medicine. Protocols designed to save life became irrelevant, replaced by methods intended to delay exposure, slow infection, and protect those not yet infected. By nightfall, the realization settled in across every hospital, every EMS dispatch, every emergency coordination center. Medicine had no answers. Treatment was impossible. Containment was marginal at best. Survival depended on staying untouched, unseen, silent, and physically separated from the infected. The crisis had crossed its final line, not when streets became violent, not when emergency channels jammed, but when medicine admitted it had nothing left to offer, and the people who could have fought the infection were forced to fight for their own lives instead. By the early hours of the following morning, the pattern was undeniable. What started in Houston was not localized. Cases were appearing in neighborhoods that had no contact with one another, yet exhibited identical behavior. The hallmark signs were unmistakable: sudden aggression, total disregard for pain, relentless movement toward others. Early reports confirmed the same pattern in nearby cities, and the first grim conclusion was whispered across command channels. This was transmissible. At first, officials hesitated to call it a virus. They called it an anomalous neurological event, a rapid-onset psychotic outbreak. Anything that implied control might still be possible. But then the data came in. Blood samples, saliva swabs, and tissue cultures showed a pathogen unlike anything previously recorded. Transmission required direct contact, primarily bites and scratches, but the speed was horrifying. Minutes, sometimes seconds, between exposure and neurological collapse. Families infected one another in living rooms. Roommates in shared apartments were incapacitated before anyone could call for help. Hospitals became high-risk zones for both staff and patients. Even brief interactions, a hand held too long, or a splash of blood, could trigger new cases in minutes. Some medical staff recorded entire wings shutting down as one patient infected 2, who then each infected 3 more, in a chain reaction that left corridors empty, silent except for the sound of doors being slammed to keep the infected contained. Staff barricaded themselves in offices and supply closets, often armed, sometimes desperate enough to barricade infected loved ones inside the rooms they had once treated. Families learned quickly that distance was not enough if trust remained. Parents tried to comfort children. Spouses reached for hands. Friends stepped forward to assist. Within seconds, the contact they intended to be comforting became lethal. Every attempt to help transformed into a transmission vector. Early infection cases in homes and apartment buildings became incubators for new outbreaks, and people learned the hard truth. Every act of care could kill. Emergency orders spread faster than the virus itself. Shelter-in-place protocols were issued for entire districts, but compliance was patchy because the danger inside homes was equal to, or worse than, the danger outside. Some families sealed themselves in basements, living rooms, closets, anything that could be locked. Others barricaded themselves with furniture, weapons, anything available. Noise became a liability. Shouting, crying, even laughter could draw the infected toward them, triggering new chains of attack. Public transit hubs became flashpoints almost immediately. Buses, trains, and airports were identified as points of accelerated infection, where high density, short exposure, and inevitable contact made containment nearly impossible. Videos from security feeds show passengers panicking, attacking one another, fleeing trains mid-ride. Airport security footage captures chaotic departures, travelers bitten mid-step, luggage left behind, and crews overwhelmed by people who should have been strangers, but were now carriers of the same unstoppable force. Authorities tried to quarantine districts, but by the time checkpoints were erected, the virus had already moved ahead. Early containment plans failed not because of numbers, but because of velocity. The infected didn't act rationally, didn't obey orders, didn't flee from danger. They moved toward the living, toward noise, toward life. Conventional barriers, from barricades to armed officers, slowed them, but never stopped them. Evacuation convoys were ambushed within blocks, leaving only bodies and chaos behind. Military and law enforcement faced the first of many impossible choices. Infected civilians were treated not as patients, but as lethal threats. Any hesitation meant risk to those attempting rescue. Entire urban zones became red lines, with active zones where people could not enter without facing near certain death. Communication channels emphasized avoidance and surveillance, instructing officers to prioritize containment over contact. Each decision underscored a brutal new reality. The virus could not be reasoned with, negotiated with, or subdued. By midday, the world began to recognize the global implications. Early alerts from international health organizations, scattered intelligence reports, and airline monitoring showed similar cases in major travel hubs: New York, London, Paris, Tokyo, Dubai, Singapore, Mumbai. The infection exploited human connectivity. The same networks that carried commerce and communication now carried AES in minutes. Borders could close, flights could be grounded, but the virus had already seeded itself worldwide. By nightfall, transmission was no longer just a medical fact. It was a psychological weapon. Families, neighborhoods, even entire cities had learned the horrifying speed of contact. The safest position became isolation, silence, and distance. Every act of closeness was a calculated risk. And yet, even in isolation, reports indicated that once the infected reached critical density, chaos radiated outward, overwhelming containment measures. Humanity was learning its limits too late, while the virus had already confirmed them. By the time morning arrived, Houston, as it had been known, was gone. Streets once alive with commuters and families were now battlegrounds. Police lines had broken, barricades toppled, and neighborhoods fell silently into pockets of chaos. The city was no longer governed by law, by reason, or by safety. It was being claimed block by the infected. Every step forward by officers met with bodies that should have been human, but moved with a relentless, unthinking intent. Law enforcement quickly realized that conventional methods were meaningless. Firearms slowed the infected only momentarily. Tasers failed to interrupt attacks. Even teams armed with rifles and shields were forced to retreat as individuals continued forward after severe injuries that should have stopped them. Officers describe an unnatural persistence, a physical momentum unbroken by pain, fatigue, or fear. The response became defensive rather than protective. Survival replaced service. Hospitals, already under siege, became death zones. Emergency rooms were abandoned mid-operation. Floors once dedicated to care now held only containment. Patients restrained and left where staff could not safely enter. Stories emerged of nurses trapped with infected co-workers, doctors barricading themselves in supply rooms, while hearing the screams of colleagues being torn apart just doors away. Shelters of medicine were now havens only in name. By afternoon, the city's infrastructure began to fail systematically. Power stations were abandoned as engineers were attacked en route. Communications faltered under the weight of calls, texts, and alerts that could not be managed. Water treatment facilities shut down, leaving taps dry within hours. Traffic lights and public transport systems became death traps as the infected moved through crowded intersections with impunity. Houston was fragmenting, and the fragmentation was accelerating. Martial law was declared, but its implementation was too slow. Checkpoints were overwhelmed within minutes. Soldiers sent to contain districts encountered the same relentless aggression. The rules of engagement were rewritten in real time. No negotiation, no restraint. Lethal force only. Even then, they could not prevent the collapse. Entire blocks were evacuated, not to save the inhabitants, but to prevent the infected from spreading further. Survival, not rescue, became the mandate. Families were caught in the crossfire. Attempts to flee were met with streets clogged by abandoned vehicles and bodies. Parents locked children in closets. Spouses sealed themselves in rooms with makeshift barriers. Even those who survived the night in their homes understood that, once they emerged, the city itself would test their ability to move safely. Windows became vantage points, not portals. Silence became a shield. Noise became a death sentence. Reports from social media, what little remained, painted the city as a fractured map of human suffering. Videos show neighbors attacking neighbors, friends biting friends. Individuals that minutes earlier had shared meals now became vectors of destruction. Fear mutated into strategy. Families would barricade themselves for hours, sometimes days, only to emerge into streets where survival depended on speed, observation, and luck. Houston was no longer a city. It was a testing ground for humanity's capacity to endure. The infected displayed patterns that were horrifyingly uniform. They moved toward sound, toward motion, toward life. But there was no cognition, no planning, no coordination beyond instinctive impulse. Entire districts were cut off from each other as the infected converged and moved in predictable arcs, following the unconscious rules of predation. Emergency responders who observed from rooftops noted the almost mechanical precision of their movement, a force of nature disguised in human form. By evening, the realization became unavoidable. Parts of Houston were lost. Entire neighborhoods had become non-viable zones, areas too dangerous to enter. Authorities began labeling sectors not by streets, but by viability. Red zones, black zones, containment zones. Safe corridors were temporary illusions. Survival was measured in minutes, not hours. Even those who had barricaded themselves successfully understood that the city had changed forever. And still, somewhere beyond the chaos, the city continued to function in the minimal sense necessary for the infected to keep moving, to keep spreading. Houston's skyline, once a symbol of commerce and life, was now a fragmented horizon of fire, smoke, and motionless bodies. This was not just an outbreak. This was a city succumbing to a force that could not be reasoned with, controlled, or negotiated. Humanity had lost its grip, and the infected were claiming the ground inch by inch, street by street, heartbeat by heartbeat. By midday, reports were coming in from across the globe, confirming the worst fears. AES was no longer confined to Houston. Early alerts from international health organizations, combined with scattered intelligence from travel hubs, revealed identical outbreaks in major cities worldwide. Paris, London, Moscow, Tokyo, Singapore, Dubai, Mumbai. Airports and train stations had become ignition points, carrying the virus across continents faster than any quarantine could react. Airline crews were among the first to notice. Passengers attacked mid-flight. Cabin crew unable to intervene as bites and scratches spread in minutes. Planes diverted to remote airports, only to find the terminals overwhelmed with infected travelers. Quarantine zones were established on the tarmac, but even those measures were too little, too late. Flights that had departed hours earlier had already seeded new outbreaks in distant cities. AES had leveraged human mobility as a weapon before the world could comprehend the threat. Governments scrambled to respond. Borders closed, public transit suspended, and militarized checkpoints erected in major urban centers. Yet these efforts often failed immediately. The infected did not respect lines or barriers. Rail stations, subways, and highway checkpoints became flashpoints as aggression spread through touch and proximity faster than containment teams could react. Some cities reported clusters of infection appearing simultaneously across multiple neighborhoods, suggesting either extraordinarily rapid local transmission or near instantaneous seeding from travelers. The global pattern was horrifying in its symmetry. Citizens observed the same hallmark behaviors everywhere: sudden aggression, disregard for personal injury, relentless pursuit of the living. Hospitals in Europe and Asia mirrored the same collapse that had occurred in Houston. Emergency rooms became war zones. Patients attacked staff mid-treatment. Medical teams barricaded themselves in supply rooms, and entire wards were abandoned. Lessons from Houston arrived too late, and the human toll began compounding exponentially. Airports and ports became the epicenters for international spread. Travelers bitten or scratched by infected companions became carriers within minutes. Security footage showed families torn apart in terminals, crowds dissolving into chaos, and staff retreating under fire from people who had once been ordinary passengers. Attempts to isolate affected flights or vessels failed when crew or passengers were already compromised. Global air travel inadvertently turned into a delivery network for the virus. World leaders convened emergency sessions, but the communication lines were strained. Media coverage amplified both panic and misinformation. Early reports suggested conflicting symptoms or localized containment, creating false hope. In cities like London and Tokyo, hospitals issued frantic calls for citizens to stay indoors. But once people realized neighbors, friends, and strangers could flip in seconds, even the safest-looking areas became unsafe. Fear spread as fast as the pathogen itself. Law enforcement faced the impossible. Officers were ordered to treat the infected as lethal threats rather than patients. Conventional crowd control was ineffective. Protective equipment failed to prevent bites in close quarters. Military teams were deployed to reinforce urban centers, often arriving only to find that entire neighborhoods were already declared non-viable. Strategy shifted from rescue to observation and attrition. Contain where possible, hold the line, and wait for the infection to exhaust itself. The virus's neurological override ensured uniformity across cultures, geographies, and populations. Citizens of Paris, Moscow, and Mumbai exhibited the same relentless aggression, the same disregard for their own survival, the same instinctive drive toward other living humans. Researchers studying early cases speculated that AES targeted fundamental human brain circuits, limbic, motor, and impulse control, in a way that made every infected individual a vector with predictable behavior, but impossible to reason with. As night fell across Europe and Asia, cities lit up with fire and emergency lights. Surveillance cameras captured people barricading themselves in apartments, families locking doors to keep loved ones inside, and streets that once thrummed with life, now eerily empty except for the roaming infected. Social media feeds became grim archives of rapid transformation. Videos of mid-flight attacks, office spaces descending into chaos, children barricaded in classrooms. Panic spread faster than official advisories, and misinformation added fuel to the fire. By the close of the day, the world had learned a bitter truth. Containment was already failing. AES wasn't a local event. It was global. Humanity's reliance on mobility, connectivity, and shared space had become a liability. No city was immune. No strategy guaranteed safety. Survival required distance, silence, vigilance, and luck. And even that was fragile. The virus had turned familiar streets, homes, and transit hubs into zones of unimaginable danger. The world, for all practical purposes, had lit up in alarm, chaos, and fear. By the time the global spread became undeniable, the rules had already changed. Humanity's instinct to intervene, to comfort, to rescue, had become a liability. Every attempt to assist or treat the infected resulted in new cases, new chaos, and new deaths. Governments began issuing directives with a clarity born of desperation. Avoid contact, isolate completely, and consider anyone infected as a lethal threat. This was no longer about saving the infected. It was about preserving those still uninfected. Military doctrine evolved faster than anyone could have anticipated. Soldiers, previously trained to subdue and rescue, now faced a virus that could not be reasoned with, negotiated with, or subdued. Every encounter required lethal force. Firearms became primary containment tools, not defensive options. Conventional engagement rules were abandoned. Engagement distance became the most important variable. Close quarters combat guaranteed infection in seconds. Entire urban areas were sectioned off into high-risk and non-viable zones, and orders were explicit. Do not enter without extreme caution. The infected were not human in any functional sense. They retained physical form, yes, but the impulses driving them were stripped of empathy, morality, and self-preservation. Commanders and first responders quickly realized that traditional policing or medical intervention would only slow the inevitable. Attrition became the strategy. Wait for metabolic collapse. Wait for exhaustion to overcome the aggressive neurological override and avoid unnecessary exposure. Each decision came with a psychological toll, knowing that the people being ignored were once human, and that choice meant life or death. Secure zones began to form. Militarized pockets, where infrastructure remained functional and population density was tightly controlled. Entry required screening, isolation, and submission to strict protocols. Curfews were enforced with lethal consequences. Residents were given instructions in short, precise directives. Do not touch anyone infected, do not congregate, and never leave designated zones without authorization. Survival became a matter of obedience rather than instinct, a grim replacement for normal life. Every communication emphasized the reality that conventional help was no longer an option. Hospitals could not treat everyone. Ambulances could not reach every emergency. Military and law enforcement could not protect civilians outside of controlled zones. Families were forced to make impossible decisions, isolate a loved one showing early signs, abandon a home, or risk everyone by staying. The global psyche began to fracture under the pressure, and societal cohesion collapsed in regions not yet fully consumed. Infected individuals were treated as living weapons. Every bite, scratch, or fluid contact meant near-instant transformation. This transformed engagement strategies. Soldiers trained to de-escalate had to switch to containment through observation and separation, minimizing exposure. Rescue was replaced by surveillance, triage replaced by distance, and human instinct for empathy became a vulnerability. Leaders made decisions based on probability, not morality. Every zone that fell to infection was cataloged and abandoned to preserve uninfected populations elsewhere. Attrition was brutal and calculated. The infected metabolically burned themselves out within days, sometimes even hours, leaving streets littered with exhausted bodies, but not before spreading further. The virus acted like a predator and a contagion simultaneously. Military planners realized that speed, precision, and patience were now essential. They began mapping zones by potential infection density, treating some areas as lost, accepting human casualties as inevitable, while focusing resources on maintaining infrastructure, safe corridors, and zones deemed strategically vital for societal continuity. Communication from global authorities carried a stark tone. Citizens were instructed that AES could not be reasoned with, cured, or contained with conventional medical tools. Safe behavior was limited to isolation, avoidance, and adherence to strict military and civil guidelines. Panic and desperation still broke through in some regions, but protocols were designed to minimize risk and enforce discipline. Survival had become systemic, a combination of strategy, compliance, and restraint. The psychological toll was profound. Survivors in safe zones watched feeds from abandoned districts, seeing neighbors, friends, and family transformed into carriers of uncontrollable aggression. Some attempted intervention and failed. Others refused to act at all, weighed down by guilt and necessity. PTSD, survivor's guilt, and acute anxiety became immediate societal challenges as the realization sank in. Even compliance offered no guarantee of survival, only increased odds. By the end of the first week of global spread, humanity had adapted to a new baseline. Rules of survival were no longer suggestions. They were laws of life. Observe, isolate, avoid, and let attrition do its work. Contact with the infected was fatal. Compassion had to be tempered by calculation. Love became dangerous. Streets, homes, and cities were no longer just locations. They were potential vectors. Civilization, in this sense, had shifted from rescue and care to observation, patience, and endurance. The virus dictated the terms, and humanity was learning to obey. By the time the first secure zones were established, the world had already shifted into a new paradigm of survival. Cities once bustling with life were now silent or hostile. Military forces had cordoned off districts, establishing strict curfews, surveillance checkpoints, and lethal enforcement protocols. These zones were designed to preserve infrastructure and protect uninfected populations, but they came at an immense cost. Freedom, privacy, and the familiar rhythms of society were sacrificed for sheer survival. Entry to a secure zone required strict screening. Every individual was checked for signs of AES, and anyone displaying symptoms or who had been in contact with the infected was immediately quarantined or eliminated. Families were separated. People were forced to make choices between safety and connection, often abandoning loved ones to ensure their own survival. The infected could not be reasoned with, and even brief contact meant transformation in minutes. Compliance was mandatory, and disobedience lethal. Within the zones, life became a regimented pattern. Movement outside designated areas was forbidden. Hours were monitored, resources distributed with precision, and communication strictly controlled. People were given clear instructions. Avoid unnecessary movement. Maintain distance from others, and follow military orders without question. Survival depended on discipline. The social contract that had once governed communities was replaced by rules dictated by necessity and fear. The psychological toll of living in secure zones was immediate and profound. Survivors were surrounded by reminders of the outside world's collapse. Video feeds from abandoned districts, reports of cities overrun, and the occasional brief glimpse of the infected attempting to breach perimeter fences. Even inside, anxiety and trauma were constant companions. Every scream, every shout, Every sudden sound became a potential warning. Sleep was fractured, and the threat of exposure was relentless. Resource management became a matter of life and death. Food, water, medical supplies, and fuel were rationed with military precision. Civilian attempts to hoard or bypass regulations were met with enforcement, often violent. Social order, fragile under the weight of fear, required both authoritarian oversight and strict compliance. Any lapse in discipline could result in infection spreading even within the secure zone, turning safety into immediate danger. The infected, meanwhile, continued to spread outside the zones. Streets, parks, and abandoned neighborhoods were left to their metabolic attrition. Observation posts tracked clusters of activity, mapping the movement of aggression, but direct intervention was minimized. Containment was the priority, not rescue. Military units learned that every unnecessary engagement led to casualties, not victories. Patience and calculation became survival tools for both troops and civilians alike. In some zones, temporary shelters were converted into fortified living areas. Barricades were erected using debris, reinforced with metal and concrete. Cameras, sensors, and patrols monitored movement, ensuring infection could not breach. These lifeboats of civilization were protective, yet oppressive, emphasizing survival over comfort. People moved in coordinated patterns, ate on schedule, and slept under observation. Every action, however small, became part of a broader strategy to stay alive. Trust became scarce. Residents learned to avoid contact with anyone outside their immediate household. Even inside the zones, brief interactions were minimized. Psychological strain mounted as individuals struggled with isolation, grief, and survivor's guilt. Every day brought news of distant failures, cities lost, families destroyed, reminding them that the world beyond their fences was a relentless, unforgiving threat. Military doctrine continued to evolve alongside human adaptation. Zones were assessed not only for resource capacity, but also for potential exposure. Non-viable areas were abandoned without hesitation. Evacuation plans prioritized infrastructure and critical personnel, not the general population. Ethical dilemmas were constant, but the guiding principle remained clear. Preserve the uninfected at all costs. Each zone became a controlled ecosystem, a fragile island of order amid global chaos. By the end of the first month, secure zones had become humanity's last bastions. The rules of survival, avoid contact, isolate, obey, endure, were internalized. Every decision carried weight. Every misstep could mean death. Life within these zones was grim, regimented, and authoritarian, but it was life nonetheless. The infected roamed outside, the world remained broken, and survival had become a matter of discipline, strategy, and the hard acceptance that the world as it once was no longer existed. By now, the outbreak was unmistakably global. AES had leveraged human connectivity to strike every continent, every major city, leaving patterns that were horrifyingly uniform. New York, London, Tokyo, Mumbai, Dubai, all showed the same neurological collapse, the same relentless aggression, the same inability to respond to pain or reason. Governments scrambled, but containment was already failing in multiple regions. Borders closed, flights grounded, ports locked down. But the virus had already jumped oceans, crossing continents with a speed that left authorities perpetually behind. Airports became epicenters of devastation. Flights that had departed hours before the first alerts brought the infected to new cities within minutes of landing. Crowds panicked as people attacked one another, biting, scratching, and transforming friends and strangers alike. Security personnel retreated, overwhelmed by the sheer unpredictability of the infected. Terminals were abandoned, luggage and debris strewn across concourses, while planes sat on tarmacs, passengers lost or transformed. Travel hubs had become inadvertent incubators for chaos. Urban infrastructure began failing worldwide. Power grids faltered as engineers abandoned stations in fear of exposure. Water systems broke down, leaving millions without clean supplies. Roads became littered with abandoned vehicles, corpses, and barricades. Emergency services were unable to respond effectively, overwhelmed by both direct attacks and secondary emergencies. Hospitals faced the same collapse seen in Houston. Staff barricaded themselves, wards abandoned, patients left unmonitored. The virus had turned global society into fractured islands of survival. Public communication struggled to keep pace with the crisis. Mixed messages, misinformation, and incomplete data fueled panic. Social media feeds were filled with clips of violence, chaos, and desperation. Citizens became both observers and participants in a worldwide nightmare. The fear was amplified by uncertainty. No one could predict who would turn next, and even the closest loved ones were potential threats. Silence became a strategy, and every sound outside controlled zones carried the weight of danger. Military forces were stretched to their limits. Troops were deployed to reinforce major cities, establish secure zones, and prevent infected populations from spilling into uninfected areas. Yet even with these measures, entire districts were lost. Soldiers were forced to make impossible ethical decisions, abandon some areas to preserve others, prioritize critical infrastructure over civilian populations, and accept attrition as the only effective containment strategy. Humanity's ability to intervene was now measured in probability, not certainty. Resource scarcity became critical. Supply chains fractured as trucks, ships, and trains were disrupted by infected populations and abandoned routes. Food, water, and medical supplies were rationed with military precision. Citizens in secure zones were forced to adapt to strict schedules, coordinated movements, and rationed consumption. Any deviation, hoarding, or unauthorized movement was met with enforcement. Survival depended on discipline, observation, and acceptance of the harsh new order. The virus's neurological effect created uniform behavior patterns across cultures, races, and geographies. Individuals everywhere were stripped of higher cognitive functions, driven solely by predatory impulses. Cities observed the same relentless patterns, people moving toward the living, indifferent to injury or environment, spreading contagion in minutes. Researchers confirmed that AES exploited fundamental neural circuits common to all humans. There was no immunity, no resistance, and no reasoning to appeal to once infection occurred. The psychological impact of global collapse was devastating. Survivors in secure zones were confronted with the evidence of widespread failure. Entire neighborhoods abandoned, loved ones turned or lost, and cities that were once thriving now reduced to non-viable zones. Anxiety, grief, and survivors' guilt compounded the challenge of maintaining order and morale. Mental health became as critical as physical survival, as communities struggled to maintain cohesion under constant stress and fear. Coordination between nations became a matter of necessity rather than diplomacy. Military and civil authorities shared data on outbreaks, infection patterns, and secure zones. International aid was limited, delayed, and often redirected to strategic locations deemed essential for survival. Ethics were subordinated to survival calculations. Decisions about who could be helped and who could not became a cold, systematic reality. Humanity faced a global triage that tested both governance and moral frameworks to their breaking points. By the end of the first month of international spread, the world had changed irrevocably. Civilization had become a network of secure zones, isolated pockets of order amid vast swaths of collapse. Daily life was regimented. Survival depended on strict adherence to protocols, and the infected roamed everywhere outside controlled areas. Humanity had adapted, but the adaptation was grim, authoritarian, and unrelenting. The global strain was not just viral, it was societal, psychological, and structural. The planet had been reshaped, and survival required obedience, vigilance, and the acceptance that the world as it once was no longer existed. The first month gave way to the second, and with it came a grim, inescapable realization. Attrition would outlast desperation. AES had swept through the initial waves of infection with a calculated, brutal efficiency, leaving streets clogged with exhausted, hollow-eyed bodies, and secure zones standing as isolated fortresses amid a shattered landscape. The outside world had become a silent graveyard, punctuated only by the distant echo of collapse, burned-out vehicles, abandoned storefronts, and the occasional desperate figure, moving like a ghost between ruins. But survival, for those trapped behind the fortified walls, was no triumph. It was endurance, measured not in fleeting victories or fleeting days, but in long, tense nights, where every cough, every groan, every shifting shadow could herald the approach of death. Inside the secure zones, existence hardened into a relentless, almost ritualized routine. Movement was strictly scheduled. Every corridor, stairwell, and common area patrolled and monitored with near military precision. Meals were rationed with ruthless logic, distributed on trays, and counted with exacting care, leaving no room for indulgence or waste. Conversations were clipped, purpose-driven, and watched for signs of dissent or fatigue. Residents moved with a mechanical cadence, their faces pale masks of obedience, their gestures stripped of spontaneity. Any lapse in discipline, any forgotten protocol, risked exposure. And the lessons of Houston, of New Orleans, of cities that had fallen, entirely, were etched into the collective memory like scars burned onto the mind. Children grew up within these walls as silent witnesses to a world that had stopped being kind. Their lessons were taught quietly, voices muffled, with a constant undercurrent of tension threading through each hour. Adults coordinated labor with whispered efficiency, tending gardens, maintaining filtration systems, and repairing walls under the oppressive vigilance of guards who had seen too much to ever be startled again. Even the simplest gestures, turning too quickly, laughing too loudly, or lingering too long in a hallway, carried a risk that had to be calculated, measured, suppressed. Every generation adapted, not in triumph, but in grim acceptance of a life dictated by rules of survival that left no room for error. And yet, the psychological weight of this existence was nearly as deadly as the virus itself. Fear was a constant companion, a tangible presence in the air, settling into the chest, with the suffocating heaviness of lead. Sleep was fractured and shallow. Dreams came in disjointed flashes of the outside world, of screams and sirens, of faces lost to the haze of infection. Loneliness, too, became its own predator, gnawing at minds even when surrounded by thousands, leaving people whispering into empty rooms, writing names in journals that no one would read, holding conversations with memories because speaking freely was a risk too great. Survival demanded sacrifice, endurance demanded obedience, and obedience exacted a toll that was quietly, relentlessly consuming the humanity of everyone inside those walls. Outside the walls, chaos remained relentless, a living entity that seemed to pulse with its own perverse rhythm. Surveillance feeds showed streets choked with the infected, staggering and crawling in unnerving waves, advancing slowly, but with a patience that was almost methodical. Fires from abandoned buildings licked the night sky, painting it in deep oranges and sickly reds, casting shadows that twisted like grotesque figures across the empty asphalt. The occasional screams of the desperate or the dying punctuated the eerie silence that hung between patrols, each sound carrying a weight that could turn stomachs and freeze hearts. Observation drones hovered overhead, their mechanical eyes sweeping the ruins, and cameras blinked unblinking from rooftops and towers, feeding streams of information to planners who treated the chaos with detached calculation. Direct engagement with the infected was rare. The military had learned that intervention only invited more losses. Survival of the zones was measured in strategy, in knowing where it was worth standing, and in leaving the rest of the world to decay. The indirect casualties mounted like shadows, silent and insidious. Food shortages gnawed at survivors who had already been hollowed by fear and disease. Injuries went untreated, infections festered, and illnesses that might once have been manageable now spiraled into death sentences. Families who had endured the first waves of AES were collapsing under the slow, grinding weight of deprivation, of exhaustion, of hope slipping quietly through their fingers. Even within the fortified walls, rationing was severe, measured in ounces and hours, and the omnipresent stress made illness spread like wildfire. A single cough, a single fever, could set off waves of panic, forcing quarantine and suspicion in a place that had already seen far too much loss. The world had been reduced to a cold calculus of survival. Only the disciplined, the alert, and the compliant had any chance of enduring. Every day became a negotiation with fate, every decision a gamble. Compassion, once a foundation of human connection, had become a liability. Every act of kindness carried with it the potential to become catastrophe. Sharing a bit of food, tending to a fevered child, or lingering too long in conversation could jeopardize entire communities, drawing attention or spreading contagion. Humanity itself had been recast as risk, and the old rules of morality had been replaced by stark efficiency and grim pragmatism. Outside, the ruins told their own story. Cars lay abandoned in twisted heaps, shop windows shattered, their interior stripped bare. Bodies, both living and dead, littered alleyways, reminders that survival was a temporary and fragile state. The wind carried strange odors, burning plastics, rot, and something sharp and metallic that clung to the senses, a constant reminder of decay. Military patrols moved like shadows through this nightmare, avoiding the infected when possible, marking zones for eventual intervention, though the planners knew that intervention often came too late. Decisions were made not in the heat of passion, but in cold calculation. Who could be saved, and who was already lost? And yet, even amid these calculations, small sparks of human struggle persisted. A lone survivor moving silently with scavenged supplies, a family huddled in a corner of a crumbling building, eyes wide with fear, but unbroken. These glimpses of life reminded planners and civilians alike that the human instinct to endure was not so easily extinguished. Still, the price of endurance was ever present. Vigilance, obedience, and a willingness to prioritize survival above everything else. In this new reality, mercy was rare, hesitation dangerous, and every day lived was a victory, precarious and fleeting. Communication was heavily monitored, filtered, and tightly controlled, leaving little room for nuance or deviation. Governments broadcast survival protocols with mechanical precision, relaying updates on high-risk zones, quarantine boundaries, and instructions for maintaining absolute discipline. Every transmission was measured, rehearsed, and repeated, designed to instill calm while subtly enforcing obedience. Yet misinformation and rumor spread faster than these official channels ever could. Whispers of collapsing safe zones, Secret outbreaks and mysterious disappearances traveled along hidden networks, through word of mouth and hacked transmissions, feeding panic that gnawed at the edges of even the most disciplined minds. Anxiety became a currency, paranoia a constant companion, and within every secure zone, people measured their lives not in days or weeks, but in the precision with which they followed instructions, aware that even a minor lapse could have catastrophic consequences. Residents huddled around flickering monitors, watching video feeds of other cities, as if peering into a mirror of potential doom. They saw families destroyed, homes abandoned, children wandering streets alone, and neighbors succumbing one by one to AES or starvation. Each frame reinforced the fragility of their own carefully constructed safety, a constant reminder that the walls around them were protection only so long as discipline and vigilance were maintained. Conversations were muted, gestures restrained, laughter a memory from another life. Fear had replaced hope as the guiding principle of existence, and every interaction carried the weight of potential exposure. Trust had become a commodity, exchanged sparingly, and suspicion hung in every shadow, in every corner, in every whispered word. Military strategy mirrored this obsessive control. Observation, containment, and isolation were paramount. Direct engagement with the infected was minimized to reduce casualties, and attrition was accepted as an inevitable, almost natural force. Patrols moved like ghosts through empty streets, scanning for movement, but rarely intervening. Their presence a signal of caution rather than rescue. In select regions, teams were deployed to reinforce barricades, maintain supply lines, and ensure the survival of key zones. But every action was calculated, every mission weighed against potential loss. Any attempt to rescue populations already infected was considered fatal folly, a lesson learned from early, catastrophic deployments. The message was clear. Survival depended not on heroism, but on restraint, observation, and unyielding discipline. Within the walls of secure zones, life became a controlled experiment in human endurance. Every hour, every task, every decision was subject to scrutiny. Routines were enforced with near military rigor. Work shifts, meal times, sanitation procedures, and security drills followed schedules dictated from above. Even minor deviations, an overlooked protocol, a forgotten checkpoint, a single miscommunicated message could ripple outward, creating vulnerabilities that might invite infection or chaos. The psychological strain was immense. People grew hyper-aware of their surroundings, noticing the faintest cough, the smallest tremor of the hands, or the anxious glance of a neighbor. Minds that once wandered freely were now sharpened to survival mode, capable of detecting threats invisible to anyone who had not endured the constant pressure. Secure zones functioned as laboratories of survival. Every individual was tested daily, not only in their ability to obey, but in their capacity to endure sustained threat and maintain composure under extreme psychological stress. Children learned discipline before imagination. Adults learned patience before comfort, and the elderly learned to endure silence before companionship. Walls that once offered refuge now imposed a new kind of captivity, one defined by fear, vigilance, and the constant anticipation of disaster. Survival was no longer about fighting the outside world. It was about mastering the interior one, controlling impulses, suppressing panic, and maintaining the fragile equilibrium that kept communities intact. Even communication within zones carried risk. Messages were monitored for tone, content, and implication. Simple statements could be misinterpreted as dissent or panic, prompting interrogations, restrictions, or enforced isolation. People learned to speak in measured phrases, to convey meaning without emotion, and to observe one another for signs of instability. Bonds of trust were cautiously formed, often temporary, fragile, and transactional. Compassion itself became a calculated risk. Sharing food, comforting a neighbor, or slowing down to help a child could endanger not only the giver, but the entire unit. Humanity had not disappeared. It had merely been repurposed into a tool for survival, precise, measured, and controlled. Outside the walls, the world was a study in chaos and decay. Observation drones mapped movement, fires illuminated the night, and military strategists calculated zones of potential survival while leaving the rest to fall. Every intervention was carefully considered. Unnecessary risk could result in the loss of thousands. Yet even as the world burned and the infected multiplied, the walls themselves became arenas of observation. Planners monitored patterns of human behavior under duress, cataloging which strategies succeeded and which failed, learning which psychological pressures led to breakdowns and which instilled resilience. In a horrifying sense, humanity itself had become both the instrument and the experiment. The lines between protector and prisoner blurred within these walls. Guards and civilians alike became enforcers of the new rules, policing not only behavior, but thought, teaching one another the vocabulary of survival. Vigilance, discipline, restraint. The safe zones were fortresses of knowledge, but knowledge carried its own burden. To know too much about what lay beyond the walls could be paralyzing, yet to remain ignorant invited disaster. People learned to live in a state of constant awareness, balancing information with action, fear with compliance, and curiosity with caution. Each day was a test, each night a meditation on endurance, and every breath drawn inside the walls was a triumph of psychological and physical resilience. Psychological strain within secure zones was compounded by the collapse beyond their walls. Every day brought new reports of cities lost, resources exhausted, and communities abandoned. Survivor guilt became a pervasive condition. Adults grappled with leaving family behind. Children bore witness to relentless death, and every individual lived under the shadow of the inevitable. Exposure meant transformation. Sleep was fragmented, dreams haunted by images of loved ones turned into predators. Life inside these zones was not safe. It was controlled, conditioned, and fragile. Medical conditions remained catastrophic. AES had left healthcare systems in ruins. Even within secure zones, treatment of non-infected illnesses was rationed. Minor injuries could become fatal, and chronic conditions went untreated. The indirect mortality rate now rivaled deaths caused by the virus itself. Human systems designed to preserve life were now instruments of triage and attrition. Society's skeleton remained, but the flesh of civilization was withering under relentless pressure. Survivors developed new skills for endurance. Observation became instinctive. Silence was protective. Movement was calculated. Every action weighed for risk. People adapted to long periods of isolation, rationed food, and constant surveillance. Communities within zones began forming mutual aid networks, quietly sharing resources, information, and emotional support. These networks were fragile and heavily controlled, but they offered glimmers of human resilience, even in a world dominated by violence, fear, and loss. By the end of the second month, the first signs of a new societal rhythm emerged. Humanity no longer thought in terms of rebuilding, only in terms of holding, preserving, and surviving. Secure zones were lifeboats in a vast ocean of chaos. Outside, attrition ran its course, slowly thinning the infected population, but not before leaving a permanent mark on global civilization. Humanity had learned that survival was no longer about hope, recovery, or restoration. It was about discipline, observation, and endurance under the long, unrelenting night of AES.